It's now time for Reset Jamaica. COVID-19 has been taking the spotlight from all of the other ills happening in our country, so much so that it's almost all that we see in the media and all that we speak about. But has things like crime stopped? Which ones have stopped? Have there been declines? Or has it been placed in the dark? Joining us today to talk about the COVID-19 reality and its impact on crime, we welcome Senator the Honourable Matthew Samuda, Minister without Portfolio in the Ministry of National Security, and the Chairman of the Jamaica Police Federation, Sgt Patrae Rowe. Gentlemen, good morning.
Morning, everyone.
Firstly, thanks for coming in person with all that is happening, some of which we're about to discuss. But we're going to start with you, Minister, to give us an overarching review as to firstly, the levels of compliance by the citizenry to the various orders, especially the curfew orders and the lockdown orders.
So what we're seeing, and certainly what's being reported to us at the ministry level, is wide-scale compliance. There have certainly been some hiccups and some difficult moments, but generally I think the citizenry and the entire country is understanding that it can't be business as usual. Nobody has made these decisions lightly, but that these decisions have been made for the better of the country and to ensure that we really do flatten the curve, as I say,
yes,
with this COVID business. So the truth is, generally, we're happy with the level of compliance, and I think a lot of credit has to be given to the members of the police force, members of the army, the healthcare workers, those who are really dealing with the effects of this of the COVID issues and who are helping to implement the measures. Their work is a credit to all of us.
Yes, and more so, Patrae, for you on the operational side, the personal side for the members of the security force, the constabulary in your case, and what they have to go through as well.
Sure. Well, the messaging from us to our officers is that this is an opportunity for us to distinguish ourselves. The police has a proud tradition of responding to the needs of the Jamaican people, especially in a time of crisis. And from all indication, favorability ratings for the police is high at this moment. I mean, I tell my guys that this is a proud moment to be a police officer because our officers are doing so well. We're out there, the people appreciate our presence. Largely, the people are complying with the orders under the Disaster Risk Management Act, and it makes our job a little bit easier, but it's not perfect. There are still some challenges that we need to work through. There are still protocols that needs to be developed so that we can manage the situation in the best way possible. But our members are doing extremely well.
Right. All right, so a bit of brass tacks now. Let us look at what the crime numbers perennially have been like in Jamaica and whether or not since, I would say, believe the first positive test was March 11. Since middle of March, what have the figures looked like, Senator?
Well, I can tell you where the figures are now, but I can tell you that in many ways, in some cases, it followed a particular trend that started before. Nationally, total reported crimes are down 14% as at Friday gone. I haven't seen the updated numbers that morning. And you have 7 categories of reported crimes, largely put into 2 blocks: serious and violent crimes and acquisitory crimes in terms of how we look at those categories. Acquisitory crimes for the last 5 or 6 years have steadily been decreasing. So it has brought down your total number of reported crimes. Even in serious and violent crimes, one of the success stories that I don't think the ministry or the police have not necessarily taken enough credit for, but certainly made the country aware enough. One of the most egregious of crimes, rape, has been steadily trending down for the last 5 years, and there's been a significant improvement in the clear-up rate. So there's credit to be made to the police. The issue that the police force, the Ministry of National Security, the country has faced for the last couple decades, well, not couple, 3, almost 4 decades, have been the issues of gun violence, largely perpetrated by the nation's gangs, and this continues to be what gives us a harder time. Now, in the case of shootings, as at Friday, shootings are down 16%. And to be clear, they were marginally down even before the COVID issues. Murder is down only marginally, although in some of the traditional hotspots, it has gone down significantly with the use of the state of emergency measures and with other operational measures that the police have been using. But murder is certainly not where we want it. It's not following quite the trends of of some of the other categories of crime in the way that we want, which tells us that there's still a lot more to be done, and we do still have quite a steep mountain to climb in terms of taming the nation's gangs and taming gun violence. There's a lot to be done legislatively, there's a lot to be done for the infrastructure, there's a lot to be done in terms of beefing up our security forces, both in terms of size and adding to the training regiment that they undertake to go at what is modern crime methodologies that we face. But generally, you'd have heard Minister Johnson Smith on Friday when the SOE measures were passed. We've had some stellar success in some areas of the country. The murder rate and general violent crime rate in St. James is at 17-year lows. So it shows that success is being achieved in some areas, and that is pre-COVID.
Right.
We still see, however, that in the what I'd call the industrial belt of the country, Lower St. Andrew into Kingston, stretching into sections of St. Catherine and pockets of Clarendon, issues that have bedeviled us for 30, 40 years, maintain and continue to morph and change with the times. So the police and the ministry have to make sure that the policy prescription and the legislative prescription and the investment necessary is there to give the police all the tools necessary to finally break the back of this monster. Because, I mean, when you look at the maps, if you have on Paris Hawaii whenever you get a chance and you look at the maps of incidents of crime over the last 30 years, it's the same communities generally that's been inflicted and affected by this scourge. So it says that there's more work to be done, but there are definitely lessons from the western end of the island that need to be used on the eastern end of the island to get that success. Because the truth is, if we had had the same success that we've had in the west out now in the east, we'd be seeing massive reductions
all across the board.
All across the board.
Yeah.
But it's trying times, but we will continue to put in the work and the investment necessary.
All right, Sergeant, the minister speaks about putting in the work and the investment necessary. About over the same period of time, there have often been complaints by your predecessors and you as well in terms of the equipment, the resources that would allow a constable to be better able to deal with this, but I don't even know what adjective to use. That's why I give credit to constables and members of the security forces, because some of what you have to go through, I would not want to even do it for an hour. Sure. How are things where that is concerned? Firstly, in terms of morale on the force, even with the layer that COVID causes, and generally speaking, the availability of the necessary resources to do what you're required to do. Sure.
First let me add to what Minister said. What he said is right. Certainly, one of the reasons why we have managed to maintain the successes and the reduction is because we have implemented the crisis management regime that does not abandon a particular strategy while we focus on COVID-19. We are dealing with all the crime fighting initiatives in an all-encompassing way whilst we deal with COVID. Certainly that puts a stretch on the human resources, but there has been capital investment within the policing efforts, which sees an increase in physical resources. But certainly it's a delicate balance in terms of managing the morale of members, because the demand for policing service is high at this moment. And certainly what it means is that there has to be management strategy and initiative to ensure that the delicate balance of managing an increase in morale is done in such a way that it does not depreciate our efforts.
Right.
So it's fair to say that the members are motivated, right? But if the strategies, the communication, the encouragement, what needs to be done to keep them encouraged and to keep them motivated is not properly managed, we could lose those gains. In terms of resources to fight the virus, resources are limited. And therefore, what you find is that there has to be a prioritization of distribution of resources to particular frontline officers. Our criticism is that sometimes that process is too subjective, which means that the officers that get, in some instances differs from the officers who do not get. There's no consistency island-wide.
But
right?
if I could just pretend for a moment, I mean, big stretch, that I was the Commissioner of Police this morning. I think subjective and objective would be almost a one-to-one correlation.
Yeah.
I would deploy the bulk of my resources to St. Catherine because that parish, more than the other 13, has a parish-wide lockdown. You have a shopping day today, guys. And B, because of the situation within the Portmore area. So is it that kind of disparity that you're talking about, or is it something more systemic?
Well, I mean, that has been done. And resources has been pushed into St. Catherine because of the situation there.
Right.
But for example, there is no prescriptive way to dictate the distribution of supplies. So you find that on the ground, an officer will say to you, Mr. Rowe, I've only been given 1 mask to serve me for 12 hours, you know, and 3 gloves. And, you know, we're saying that these situations, it needs to be a more objective distribution of these resources to look at because 1 mask, a mask for 12 hours in the elements, the mask depreciates and loses its, its integrity after a while. Yeah. And therefore we'll have to look at those kind of deployment. But the point is that this is a time where managers have to manage. And you find that the countries who are doing well in terms of managing the crisis are countries who have demonstrated incredible and strong leadership. And that has to cascade down through our middle managers and management level to ensure that the management is on point. And one of the things that we are doing as a police federation is to do management audit, resource audit, distribution audit across the island to ensure that managers are doing what they're supposed to do. And where they are not, we are saying to the commissioner, I mean, this is the case, we're asking you to do something about it. If it means removing managers and relieving people of their command to ensure that our members benefit from the best leadership. Right. I mean, this is a time for leaders to distinguish themselves. Well, right?
Because of the viewers, because of the principled and factual situation of separation of powers. Some of the points that Patrae is raising, I cannot relate to Matthew because they're of an operational nature. Sure. But I'm almost hearing you say, Minister, that then the Commissioner relays that to you, the ministry, the team at the ministry, which includes the PS, yourself, and Minister Chang, who are doing as best as they can?
Well, our job is really to ensure that they have the right legislative and policy framework from which to operate in, and that they get the resources, or as much of the resources as they can get within our fiscal framework provided to them. We've certainly done well in providing, and the fiscal space has allowed over the last 2 years. We've improved significantly the work conditions across 186 police stations where there's been renovation works. And in some cases, new stations put up where they were in deplorable conditions. We're seeing the gains from the benefit of the investments in mobility. Some of the reasons why you've seen quick response and ability to curtail or to apprehend persons who have perpetrated crimes really quickly has been because of the provision of bikes, the provision of cars, the provision of SUVs and other items for mobility. So, you know, we're giving the investment that we believe is in many ways overdue for the police to be able to do their work. And we are working very closely to ensure that the policy framework and the legislative framework that they require and that has been recommended in some cases over decades comes to fruition. So there are a number of pieces of legislation that we're working on. There are several policy initiatives that are underway, and we're doing our best to make sure that the investment keeps pace with the need to modernize the force. Because the men and women of the force do deserve the best chance to achieve what we all want in Jamaica, which is a safer space. Right.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times the legislative support. Sure. That's something that we both know a little bit about. Now, there are a couple of legislation that are no longer fit for purpose. One of them, the Disaster Risk Management Act, comes up for a 5-year review, which is actually 2020. You have the Quarantine Act, you have various other acts that were they fit for purpose in the wake of COVID, there could be better responses from the state. How quickly do you think that process of reviewing that cluster of legislation will commence? Well, that process is already underway at the Ministry of Justice. Minister Delarichuk has taken hold of these items, and I know he's to come back to Cabinet, I think, not this Monday, but next Monday, based on the timelines he had suggested with some of the pieces
that we see that requires, I think, urgent update. You know, I mean, you've been a legislator. It's sometimes very frustrating to sit in chambers. You would meet for longer hours. You would put in additional days if there was legislation coming to you fast enough in terms of the modernizing process. So what you find is that governments have to prioritize and use the limited resources that we do in terms of the legislative drafting process to deal with the crisis of the day as opposed to getting ahead of it. And I think this is just another example of that. And it's unfortunate. And I think nationally we'll have to agree that our legislative framework, many pieces of it don't really suit us in the 21st century. And we'll have to, regardless of fiscal space, we'll have to have a conversation about bigger allocations to that in the future, in the near future as well, because it's not going to be possible for us to modernize any sect of society with the legislative framework that we largely inherited from pre-colonial times.
Yeah, from Britain. No, there's another aspect of the security apparatus. Certainly, I've come across many of their officers in the public space, and they've criticized society generally, leadership, and this program for always particularizing the constabulary force or the defense force, and that's the Department of Corrections Services. Sure. With respect to COVID in particular, large cluster populations have been impacted. So far, nothing of that reporting, yes, go ahead, knock on wood, has happened in any of our penal institutions across the country. What are the concerns? What are the proactive steps that are being taken?
So we are particularly concerned about our correctional facilities. Now, we had to take some steps pretty early on to ensure that there were no incidents of COVID in our facilities, and so far so good. Yes. We had to suspend visits, which, if you understand the prison system, that's a major decision to take because it affects the psychological health of our inmates, and it's a major part of keeping the prison population calm as well. But that was very important that we suspended visits. We also had to stop taking gift items, whether food or otherwise, from families of inmates, which is also another situation that creates some amount of distress and difficulty. But it's a decision we had to make because the virus won't magically appear in any of our facilities. It would have either been brought in by a visitor, by one of the items that the visitors brought, or by our warders. Now, we certainly can't stop our warders from coming in. But what we've done, we've implemented several measures, and we've put in some infrastructure that we believe helps. But the measures in particular, we've insisted on hand washing and hand sanitizing all throughout the facilities. We've now implemented our mask protocol, and we're trying to keep pace with the demand for masks within our officers, and trying to ensure that we don't reach to the 12-hour mark, even though sometimes it's difficult finding the supplies as quickly as you need, even where the fiscal space exists. We also implemented a questionnaire at our entry points, so that we're able to do some of the pre-work should an incident arise in terms of who have you been around, where have you been, where have you traveled, have you shown any symptoms, have you been knowingly to any of these areas, that sort of thing, so that we make our warders very conscious from the moment they arrive at work to the moment they leave of the impact that they could have. Right. But we've put in place additional infrastructure by way of wash stands all throughout our facilities. We've purchased what we can in terms of supplies. We also we have implemented temperature checks at all points of entry within our facilities. Now, we can't guarantee that there will never be a case of COVID in our space. What we've also done procedurally, which is very different, is that the inmates that have continued going to court since the first case in Jamaica are isolated for 2 weeks from the rest of the prison population.
Well, on that point, because this is also now where the constabulary interacts with the penal system, because when a prisoner leaves to go to court, they leave in the custody of the police. The police are deployed across the general population, and it is in the general population that we have had incidents of COVID. What are the receiving protocols that the constabulary force has in place that when a prisoner is being sent to for a court appearance, that the necessary checks and balances are in place?
Well, I mean, this is a major point of advocacy, certainly for us. We have been very vocal on this issue. In fact, we called early for the closure of visits and accepting food items from members of the public. But it's a more technical situation for us than they see, because the prisons are more self-sufficient. They prepare food and everything for their inmates. In our jails, we rely on relatives to bring toiletries and food for the jailers, the persons who we house, even though the state provides food. However, there are protocols in place in terms of filter cells. Certainly it helps know that court is not in progress,
yes.
Because there's no movement of accused persons to court.
Right.
And therefore that movement is restricted now. However, what the JCF has implemented are filter cells to prevent infection of the general cell population. In a number of our police divisions, the major facilities is now currently housing 100 and odd people. And therefore, there becomes a need for a filter cell at one of the outstations or so to have these persons there for 2 weeks for a quarantine period. To ensure that if they show any signs or symptoms, then you do not put them in the general population. So, and where those filter cells are, our members are issued with the appropriate gears. It does not happen 100% of the case, but where we see gaps, we make contact with Commissioner or stores or the DCP administration for the relevant distribution to be done.
Right.
So it's an ongoing process where we continue to monitor and audit these situations, but there are protocols in place to safeguard, because it's a vulnerable point.
Yeah, and speaking of it being a vulnerable point, yes. And as we close, do you have an estimate, or what's your best estimate of how many Jamaicans are incarcerated in lockups at police stations?
Well, I wouldn't be able to say, but it's thousands.
Right. And Minister, final points as we go in terms of your look in the camera tip to Jamaica to help to keep the situation better, improving rather than deteriorating.
You know, the protocols have been spoken about by all of our leaders, by all of our media persons. Keep your distance, wear your mask, hand sanitize and wash your hands as often as you can. Stay home if you don't need to be on the road. The virus doesn't move by itself, thank God. It's not one of those that are airborne in a particular manner. It doesn't live in the air very long. So we have to move the virus along. So if we stop moving, the virus stops moving.
Right.
And we can get back to normal as soon as is humanly possible. So I implore all Jamaicans, follow the guidelines. It's very important that we get this under control, because there will be life after COVID, and we have to look to how we will rebuild what was heading in the right direction after this.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you very much.
As well as Sergeant, for joining us this morning. That was Reset Jamaica. We pause for a cause. More Sunrise after these messages.